Okay, so welcome to the bonus episode. I'm going to really quickly go over controller support. It's very easy. Plus, we already kind of set it up in a way where our code will act very friendly with it. I'm going to do that, and then I'll do room transitions also. I'm not going to do them super in depth, but I'll show you exactly what I did because I've covered them in another video, so I'll point you over there, and then I'll show you how I added it to this and some of the things that I had to consider whenever adding in room transitions to this project, because there were a couple things that needed to be not really changed, but just sort of accounted for. So yeah, this one will just be pretty chill, and then we're just going to talk about the project after that and just sort of discuss things, design possibilities, all that kind of stuff. If you want to hear some more like creative side of it, or I guess design side of it, as opposed to the technical side of the actual implementation. So anyways, let's just do the controller stuff first. So you're going to need an Xbox Microsoft controller. They just work nice with PCs. There are programs you can use to map controllers to key bindings. There are also programs like I don't know if this still really is a thing, but DS4 Windows, DualShock 4 Windows, where it basically takes a DualShock 4 controller, which is a PS4 controller, and converts it to an X input controller, which is like a Microsoft controller. So, but the point is, a wired USB Xbox 360, Xbox Series X, Xbox One controller, those should be very, very compatible with your computer and Game Maker right out the gate, and it's what most people use whenever they use controllers on their PC. So I have like a cool starry purple blue faded Xbox One controller, and I have like an old school like translucent green rock candy one, and they both work totally fine with Game Maker right now, so that should be good. But I'm also not going to promise that your computer is not going to have issues with any controller you're going to plug in. So if you've used a controller with other games on your PC before and it works there, then this should work totally fine. Okay, so first thing is, let's look into our player objects movement code, right? So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to go into the movement section, and here we have this like horizontal key and vertical key thing, which is subtracting our left and right key presses and up and down key presses to get that like 360 degree movement that we were talking about, right? Remember that? Now it'll only return increments of 45 degrees, so 0, 45, 90, 135, etc. But we kind of went over why that was something that we were doing anyways. But I also mentioned way back then that this is also to sort of help out our controller stuff, right? Because our controllers have analog sticks, which can actually return 360 degree direction. And really what we're getting, I called this horizontal key and vertical key, but really what they are is like a horizontal X axis and a vertical Y axis, right? Same thing pretty much. And Game Maker actually has controls for that. For whenever we're reading inputs on a controller, we can actually get the real analog axis values for both of our analog sticks. And so those are going to be important. So let's add in those values first, because we're going to want to have matching values for our keyboard check presses and our controller, so the game is never confused, right? So now I'm going to open up my object input, and I'm going to go into the create event under where we're getting our normal key presses, and then I'm going to add two more things, or I should say four more things actually. Left analog stick and right analog stick, but they both have two axes. So we're going to do global.x-axis left. So left. So the x-axis of our left analog stick. Again, we'll just default set it to 0, and then we're going to want the y-axis of our left analog stick, right? Boys got to learn to type. Okay, anyways, and so now we just need to do the same thing for our right as well. So x-axis for our right analog and a y-axis for our right analog. So cool. Now that we have them set, that's totally good. So the game is never going to get confused if it is referencing it and we're not utilizing it. So for example, our right analog stick, we're not going to have a, well, I was going to say an analog to it. We won't have an equivalent of it for our keyboard controls because we're using the mouse instead of the right analog stick, right? So that part of the code is just going to kind of change a little bit in general, but our left and y axis, we can actually use that with keyboard inputs because it's the same thing that we were doing with our horizontal key, right? It's just getting the difference between our right press and our left press, or our up and down. So we can go into our begin step event here, go under here, and we can get those x-axis values. So the x-axis of our left analog stick is going to be our global dot right key minus our global dot left key, like that. Easy, same thing. And getting our y-axis for our left analog stick is going to be our global dot down key minus our global dot up key. So cool. And now that we have these as global variables, we can go back into our player up here, and that's the same thing that we're doing on this line, right? So if we want, we can separate all this out. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Here we go. So I can put these in object variables and have like an x-axis left and stuff like that. But to be honest with you, it's not really going to be that necessary. We could just plug it in right here because we're storing it in this local variable anyways. So our horizontal key is going to be our global dot x-axis of our left analog stick, right? And then the vertical key is going to be our global dot y-axis of our left analog, which funnily enough actually completely overrides our need for any of these in this specific event right now, but we can keep it anyways. It's no problem, but we can go ahead and test and make sure that this hasn't changed anything. It shouldn't have if you copied everything the right way. Oops, I'm gonna have to drag this back in. Okay, so yep, movement is still working fine. All that's normal and good. Okay, so I can get rid of that. And now that we have these global axis variables working, we can go back into our input again, and we can figure out how to get this from a controller. So let's make this bigger, and this is going to be keyboard and mouse, and down here I'm going to have controller. So the first thing we need to do is just make sure that a controller actually is even connected in the first place. And gamepads and devices have different values for whenever they're plugged into your computer. So we'll be basically checking a function called gamepad is connected, and it's just basically checking and making sure that our controller actually is going to be connected, right? And it asks for a device, and this is just a number, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. In my experience, if you have a controller plugged in and it's the only thing that's actually a controller, it will show up as 0. So I do like to store it in a local variable like this, so I'll say var gamepad equals 0, and we can plug that in here. So this is basically just saying if we have a controller connected, and if it's the only connected controller we have, it should be returning as 0, but sometimes it can't, so you might want to experiment around with this number, or setting it up in a local variable like this is good because you could potentially put it through like a loop if you needed to do that. But 0 should be fine. So now we can basically just get all these variables again in our controller object, right? So just using controller functions. And something you might want to do is before we start messing with anything, if we start changing these to controller inputs and stuff like that, what'll basically happen is if our gamepad is connected, then all these values will overwrite these values. So if you want to be able to toggle between the two while testing without having to physically unplug your controller and plug it back in, one thing that you can do is just add in a controller option, and I'll just call it global.controller mode. And we'll say 0 means we don't want to use our controller, and 1 means we do, or like a true and false, right? So let's set our controller mode to 1, and then we can put some other checks around it. So we can say if global.controller mode is equal to 0, then we'll use our keyboard and mouse controls right here. And then we'll say if global.controller mode is equal to 1, we'll use these controls down here. And that will also be a very useful variable to have in our player object whenever we're figuring out whether or not we want to use the mouse to aim or the right analog stick. So this is a good variable to have. So remember, go ahead and set it to 1. And so now we're working in our controller down here. So we already know that we're going to use our axis for our analog stick stuff. So let's just go ahead and fill out the other stuff that we can do really easily first. So the right, left, up, and down. Gamepads have D-pads, so we can very easily just check for our D-pad, right? So we can use gamepad button check, which works just like keyboard check, except we're going to be putting in gamepad constants, right? So first it's looking for the device that we want, and that's our gamepad value up here. So first gamepad, and then we can use the constants built into GameMaker for controllers. So the right gamepad button would be GP underscore pad R for gamepad pad right, D-pad right. And you should be able to figure out the rest of them from here. So I'm just going to really quickly do all those. So I've got those. They're all gamepad check. And then for left, we have pad L. For up, we have pad U. And for down, we have pad D, right? So that all makes sense. And we probably want the D-pad to also be able to move our character as well, right? We don't just want to use the analog stick. So we can actually keep this for now. So we can just move on to our shoot keys and our swap keys. So once again, we can just use gamepad button check. We're checking our gamepad value. And for our shoot key, most likely we probably want to use the right trigger. And for that value, we just have gamepad underscore shoulder RB. So shoulder R would basically be like your R1 or your right bumper on Xbox gamepads, and RB is going to be your R2 or your right trigger. So yeah, so B does not stand for bumper. It basically just stands for it's like an A and a B. So it's like B as in the secondary shoulder button. So nice. And for our swap key, we're gonna also use gamepad button check of our gamepad, except I want to use the left trigger for that. Now you can just middle click on any of these and it'll open up exactly what buttons are what on an Xbox controller, so you'll be able to map them how you want. But from a design standpoint, I think it kind of just makes the most sense, right, on a twin stick shooter. If you only have two main action buttons, which is a shoot and a weapon swap, they might as well be the triggers for your right and left hands, because your left and right thumbs are always going to be occupied with aiming and moving, right? So it kind of just works out perfectly this way. But choose whatever you want to do. And don't forget, pay attention now, this actually is not totally right, because we don't want to swap every single frame we're holding down our left shoulder, right? We want to add in the pressed here. That's very important. If you're getting issues, then that's what the issue will be caused by. So just remember, this is a pressed button, not a held down button. So make sure you have that in there. And then likewise, we have one more pressed button at the bottom here, which is the start key. And simple enough, this one is just called GP underscore start. So cool. Now our aiming won't work and our analog stick won't do anything, but we can go ahead and test the game, plug in your controller, and just make sure that it is actually working and controlling your character. So see, let's go over here, and it is. So I'm shooting with the right trigger. I don't have other weapons right now, so I can't test. Hold on, grab. Okay, and my swap key is working fine. So now we just need to get the actual, because I'm still in this 8 direction movement because I can only move with my D-pad. My analog stick doesn't work. So everything is working how it's supposed to, but now we just need to fix the aiming and add in the analog support for the left stick, right? So good, everything's working. Again, if your weapon swap is swapping things super fast while you're holding it, or it's, you know, like a million times a second, that would be what that problem is you need to change this to check pressed. So cool. Now we can talk about the analog sticks. So one thing that I like to do before I do anything with analog sticks is use this function up here. And you should recognize what this means. So this is gamepad set axis dead zone. And the dead zone of an analog stick is basically how far do you have to start pushing the analog stick before it starts giving the computer data. Or I should say, before GameMaker starts recognizing it as an analog stick push. It may not have been something you've really thought about before, but it's super important, because if this number is really, really low, basically just resting your thumb on an analog stick and not really doing anything could be enough to start moving your character in a direction, and you don't want that, because it feels terrible and it can make the players mess up all the time constantly. So we're going to pass in the gamepad that we're at, and then we're going to pass in basically just a percentage, a 0 to 1. So I like to give it like a 20% axis dead zone. Especially for this game, it's not that big of a deal to have kind of a larger dead zone. You just want to play around with it a little bit, but you want the stick to start moving pretty soon after you start pressing it. You don't want too much of a delay, but at the same time, you really don't want the player to be twitching around on their own just because the player is resting their thumb on the analog stick. So that basically means that you have to push it more than 20% away from the middle of the analog stick for it to actually start reading movement. So cool. Now we can work with our gamepad axis values. So first, I'm just going to get rid of this, subtracting the right key and the left key from here. Don't worry, we're still going to keep our D-pad functionality in there, but it'll be easier just to look at this function all on its own first. So this function is going to be called gamepad axis value. So gamepad axis value, once again, it's looking for the gamepad that we want to use. And just like all these other functions, we're going to be passing in gamepad's constant for our axes. So this is going to be GP underscore axis LH for horizontal. So horizontal meaning the x-axis. I just like to refer to them as x and y-axis. Makes more sense to me. But so this is looking for the left analog stick and its horizontal axis. And this will return a value from -1 to 1, but again, an analog value. So it can return any numbers in between -1 and 1. So yeah, that's what's going to help us get like 360-degree directions going around. So now we can just do it with the gamepad axis value of our gamepad, and we can do gamepad axis LV for vertical, which is the y-axis of our left analog. And we've already plugged these in to our player right now. So if I were to run the game right now, my left analog stick should be working perfectly fine. My D-pad won't anymore, but oh yeah, look at it, and see, look at this. Look at this like little minute movement I'm making. I'm running in like a perfect circle right now. So yeah, that's great. Like, look at these smooth, swirly lines I'm doing. Okay, so that works perfectly. And now I can show you how we can also have it work with the D-pad. So after this, we can go plus and then add some parentheses, because we can just add in what we were doing before. So global right key minus global left key. And we can do the same down here. So global dot down key minus global up key. Oopsie daisy. Okay, so this is cool. It's basically just making sure that they're both working at the same time, right? Because we're adding basically a -1 to a +1 plus a -1 to a +1. So if I were to run the game, I should now be able to move with my analog stick and with my D-pad, which is what I'm doing right now. So yeah, they both work, which is great. And technically our axis values can return -2 and +2, right? If I'm holding left with the D-pad and holding left with the analog stick, that should technically give us a -2 as a net, and it does. The only reason it's not causing us any issues right now is because in our player, we are already clamping this input level value that we have. We're already clamping it from 0 to 1. So that's the reason it's still working. However, that's just that one specific instance that we're already automatically fixing it for. So if we want to, we can also come under here and just clamp these again. So clamp our global dot x-axis left between -1 and +1, and then we can do the same thing with the y-axis left. This won't make any difference at all visually to what was already happening, but in case you need to use those variables somewhere else in your game, this will just help you clean that up and have it not be such an issue. Because if we didn't have that cleanup right there and we didn't have it in our player, then we could make our player move twice as fast just by holding right on the analog stick in the same exact direction on the D-pad. So yeah, cool. But now we want to start working in our aiming, and so that's going to be really easy as well. Now we don't have any button presses for our like right analog stick, so we only need to do basically these top two lines without this stuff. So we want our x-axis right gamepad, axis value of our first gamepad, and now we just want to use gamepad axis R horizontal. Easy peasy. And let's just fill in the Y one. So the Y axis for our right value is going to be our axis R V for vertical. And so now we have our right analog stick as well. And we just need to figure out when we want to use it, right? You can probably already guess because it's actually going to be super similar code to how we do our movement direction. So let's just go over there. I believe it's in our sprite control. Is that right? Okay, yes. So here we have our player aiming. We're getting our aim direction by using the mouse X and mouse Y coordinates. So that's all good, but that's only if we are using global dot controller mode equaling 0, right? So if we're not using our controller. So this is going to be our KBAM controls. But if we're using a controller, so if our global dot controller mode is equal to 1, then we can just use our right analog stick's information, right? We can just say aim direction equals point direction. And because our analog stick is returning values from -1 to +1, and we have an X and Y axis, our horizontal and vertical axes, then we can just check from a neutral 0, 0 point to checking our global dot X axis of our right analog stick and our global dot Y axis of our right analog stick. And remember, that's the same exact principle that we were doing for our player's movement, right? Right here. It's the same exact thing, except we're just getting our aiming direction that same way. So if I were to run the game now, my mouse isn't doing anything, but my right analog stick is. Oop, okay, hold on, got a little ahead of myself there. One last thing we want to make sure doesn't happen is this. So anytime I'm not pressing the right analog stick, it snaps back to the 0 degree position, which makes sense, right? I already explained that before, that when point direction is looking for the difference between two of the same exact point, it just defaults to giving us 0. So that's totally cool. We basically just need to set our aim direction then if our global dot x-axis right is not equal to 0, or our global dot y-axis right is not equal to 0, right? Because basically what we're just saying is only change our aiming direction if we are pressing the right analog stick in some direction. Because if both of these were 0, then that would mean we're not pressing it. So if either of them isn't 0, that means that we should be changing our aiming direction. So if I were to run the game now and we were to watch, yeah, so I can just let go of the analog stick and the player stays aiming in the same direction and I don't have to keep holding it. So nice. Just a little fix there that I almost forgot to do. So yeah, and I can just play with a controller. Look at that. Analog stick is working fine. I can also play with the D-pad if I so choose. And yeah, so the controller's in there and it's fully functioning. You just need to remember that anytime you want to add new controls or something like that, that you need to add in an equal control for your controller, right? Because I imagine a lot of people will probably test with keyboard and mouse, maybe. Not sure. I tend to test with controllers, but either way, you need an analog for both of them. Or I probably shouldn't use that word for this. You need an equivalent for both. And one thing you might be thinking of with controllers is something like, what if in our input object we had right key pressed and left key pressed? So single frame sort of situations, right? Because you can't really check an analog stick for it just being pressed. It's only just a full streaming analog value from -1 to +1. Well, you could just have like little checks and little timers and stuff like that. So I could have like a variable, for example, called controller right key pressed and set that to 0. And again, say we have a global variable called global dot right key pressed, and that's equal to 0. For our keyboard controls, that'd be very easy. We would basically just do this line, but we would say like global dot right key pressed equals keyboard check pressed, and that would do it for us. And same for down here, we would just do gamepad button check pressed and then set that to right key pressed. But for our analog sticks, it would be different. So we could do something like this. We could say key presses for analog sticks. So I could say like, if using this variable, so if controller right key pressed is equal to 0. So if this is going to be like a resetter variable. So if our resetter variable hasn't been triggered yet, and we can say our global dot x-axis left is greater than 0, which means that it's being pressed towards the right. Again, you might want to mess around with certain values, so you might want to make it like more than halfway of a press, but our dead zone is kind of taking care of some of that. So we'll just say if it's being pressed towards the right at all, then that means you're holding it to the right. Then we can do this. First, we can set this variable to 1. So stop code from running again by resetting variable, stop code. So first we can go ahead and reset that, and then we can automatically trigger the global.right key pressed variable to equal 1 on that single frame. So trigger the button press. So that's good, because what'll happen is if we're pressing to the right with our left analog stick, it will trigger this to be pressed, but then this variable will stop us from constantly having this set to positive, right? And then we just need to reset the resetter variable. And that basically just means if this is not true, so we could say if not this, or we could say just do the opposite, where if our x-axis is less than or equal to 0, so if it's not being pressed or if it's being pressed towards the right, then we can just say that this needs to be set back to 0. So it's ready to go again, which means we've basically let go of the right button, you know? So you would just need to do a similar thing for all 4 directions if you wanted to do that, or if you needed to have that, but this should work fine. Okay, let me just type this in here. I'm gonna add one more of these. There we go. So now the right key pressed is working for, should be working for the analog stick and just the D-pad. And I need to trigger something to happen there. So I'm gonna do something just dumb, and we're just gonna move the player to the right. So if global dot right key pressed is equal to true, we're just gonna jump the player over like 20 pixels or something stupid like that. Just something noticeable. And I'm going to put it above my pause menu thing here so I can do it while the game is paused, just to show it off. So let's start. Let me get over here first. I probably should have done it with the left, but okay. So if I hit pause, so if I hit to the right, okay, yeah, look at that. To the right, that's me pressing the D-pad, and that's me pressing right on the analog stick. So it's working as a button press. I'm holding the analog stick down. It's not doing anything, just as long as I'm actually pushing it over a certain amount. Now, thinking about it, checking for it to be over 0 is probably a little too, is maybe a little too generous, because you could basically be pressing straight downwards for that to work. So, you know, you might just want to tweak the feel of it, but let me show you. So instead of over 0, you could say over halfway, or, you know, greater than or equal to halfway, something like that. Now, remember, this needs to inversely work with this, right? So again, it might be easier to just put in like the same exact line of code and say not, so it just automatically resets. And you also might want to put that sort of dead zone. It's like a secondary dead zone. So we'll say var button press dead zone equals 0.5, right? So I can just plug that in here, and for any other variables that I want to do. And so I can mess around with this. So, you know what, let me just test that again. So I'm gonna put that line of code back in here. There we go. So let me see. Okay, so I'm back over here, and So I'm pressing like kind of a downward angle and it's not working. And there we go. So the 45-degree angle works right. That's probably how you should do it. You can also check the amount and check like on the angle that the analog stick is being pressed. Either way, most people aren't going to be trying to use the analog stick and the D-pad at the same time. So basically just tune it to where you think that the analog stick feels right. Probably the best method would be to just have it be like greater than 0, but also check with like var left stick direction and do like the point direction like this. So get the left stick direction and we'll say as long as it's over 0 and it should be within the correct direction range. So the x-axis is over the dead zone, and for the right, we would want the left stick direction to be less than or equal to 45 degrees, or the left stick direction to be greater than or equal to 315 degrees, because that's 360 minus 45 degrees. Again, you might not want to make it exactly 45 degrees. You might want to add some margin of error, so maybe you actually want it to be like 55 degrees, or greater than 305. Again, there's a million ways to just tweak this to get the feel of it right, but kind of what I meant about the D-pad thing is like generally whenever you're looking for button presses with an analog stick, you know, so like a right or up or down or left press, you're going to be using the actual analog values for movement and any 360 degree movement. So you're normally just going to be using that for menuing or something really simple where the diagonals don't have to be super precise or anything like that. But if you did need it really precise for some reason, that's how you could tune all this stuff. So again, I don't even really need the right button pressed code. That's not a thing I'm using as of right now, at least. So but you know what? I'll just leave it in. Why not? Why not? One bit of code that I definitely don't need though is this code right here. So anyways, that's it for the controllers. Very easy to add. Just takes a little bit of cleverness with figuring out certain problems, but that's about it. So now let me talk about room transitions really quick. So for the room transition stuff, I thought for this bonus episode, it would kind of just make a little bit of sense to just go ahead and put it in the game and then talk about it. So go in there, it takes you to a certain room in a certain position, and then you can come back and it takes you to the next room, and it keeps you facing the right way. So you see if I go in, I'm facing the right, I face the left. If I walk back this way, face forward again. So cool. Main reason that I kind of want to go through this fast, and for the sake of testing here, I'm actually going to go back into my input object really quick and change my controls back keyboard and mouse one. And so yeah, really the reason that I'm just going to go over this quick is because I've covered this in a different video in my RPG series, and it's very, very similar to what I did there. There's just a couple changes, and what I mostly want to talk about is the effect that it had on the rest of the game, right? So first, let's talk about all the objects that sort of play into it. You can see them all down here from this green warp block down. That's all of the objects that I've made, but let me show you in the room really quick. And obviously I made a second level just so we can have rooms to transition to. First thing is, remember whenever you make your new room, you need to make sure that your viewports and your cameras are enabled and that they're all the same size that they're supposed to be. The viewport size doesn't actually matter. Your first room in your game is what's going to determine your viewport size and basically your like multiplicative resolution or whatever that I kind of talked about that one time where, you know, sometimes you can have like subpixels that fit into the resolution, but sometimes you don't. All that's decided for your initialization room. So you don't really need to mess with viewport properties, but your camera properties, if you want to make your game look consistent and have it have the same feel, you're going to want to set that in all of your rooms or in code somewhere. But I don't really want to get too into it, and you can just set it in the code the same way every time. So just make sure when you make a new room, then you're doing all this stuff and you're enabling your viewports and all that. So cool. But so here are the two kind of like controlling objects here. So we have a warp block, which whenever the player touches it, it creates a warp object, which is impossible to see because it's basically invisible. But the actual warp object, which is the transition where it fades in with the diamonds and then fades out and actually moves your player and changes the room. And then we have a warp target, which is this right here, this little invisible looking player. And this is the one sort of difference that I have from that RPG series video, is instead of manually having to type in our actual coordinates and stuff like that, I just made an object that could be like a target for us to move to, and it's much easier that way. So again, if this starts to move a little too fast for you, then you can watch part 5 of my RPG series. If you are here watching this video, then you absolutely can follow that video, no problem. But maybe you just kind of need to get a look at everything, and then after that, you'll be fine. So first, let's start in our object warp. So first things first, the sprite looks invisible, and that's because this is what I did with it. This is a 32 by 32 pixel sprite, and basically it's just a diamond that grows outwards from the middle and fills up the screen. That's all it is. It's at 60 FPS, so it looks very smooth, and basically the last like 5 frames, it seems, I have as a wholly blacked out thing, because what we're going to do is it's going to animate and then it's going to reverse. So if I do like the ping pong thing, it's going to go in and then out, just like that. And then we're going to tile it across the screen. It's just a really simple way to do this, and it also means that you can make any animated tile that you want to, and you can tile that across the screen. So it could be a circle growing, or just a square, or just a side wipe, or something like that. You can do whatever you want. Again, this is the same thing I did in that video. So you can set its speed to whatever you want, do anything you want to. That's totally cool. And so here's how that warp object works. First, in our create event, I go ahead and I set the depth to be really high. I set it to be over the HUD because I want it to just completely fill up the screen and go back in. And then we have a target room variable, which tells us which room we want to go to. At default, I just say it's the same room that we're in because it doesn't matter. We're going to have to set it every time anyways. Target object, which is going to be this little guy right here to get our coordinates and the direction we want the player to face from. A little bit more on that in a minute. Again, default, just no value pretty much. And that last variable we had in here was actually just a leftover from something else I was testing. So that's actually not even necessary at all. So it's literally just these things. And before we move on to the actual step events and stuff, our creation is not really done because there's a couple important components we have here. One of which being this object is going to go between rooms, right? It's going to start in one room and then it's going to end in another room. So that means this object has to be persistent, okay? Otherwise it's going to vanish between the room transition. And likewise, that means that our player also has to be persistent, right? I don't think we already had this checked, but now our player is going to start moving between rooms, and we want our player to have the same data, right? We want our player to keep the guns that they've had or anything like that. And so we also need our player to be persistent. That's very important. Otherwise we're going to transition to a room and then the camera is just going to be probably in some random place and the player's just not even going to be there. So both of those are important. And lastly, just because we don't want the player doing anything stupid while the transition is actually happening, we've made our object warp a child of the screen pause. So that way everything pauses, player can't get themselves killed or can't get themselves in some kind of weird position that will cause problems for us while this is happening. So anytime the screen is getting cluttered with a screen transition, there's just no gameplay happening. So good. That's all of our setup. And so before we move on to our step event, the next thing for me logically was our animation and end event, right? Because we want all of the stuff in this code to start happening once we get to the end of our animation of this object, right? So the next step is our animation end event. And obviously you need to set your sprite to the warp sprite that you've set it to. But now that we're in the animation end event, we can check this, right? So we're going to be checking things based off of our image speed. So if our image speed is equal to 1, then that means we're just moving forwards, right? It's animating forwards. So once we get to the end of the animation, so this very last completely opaque frame where the screen is going to be totally covered, then we want to reverse the animation by setting our image speed to -1, and then we want to go to our target room, which we will set in the create event of our warp block. So we go to our target room. And so now the remainder of the stuff that we want to do is moving our player in the correct coordinates and then getting rid of our warp object once it's done, right? So that's where the step event comes in play. And I've done a lot of commenting on this. Oh geez, a lot of commenting. Let's just make it the whole dang screen then. Okay, well, there we go. So first we want to put the player in the correct coordinates after the room transition has happened, right? I already explained that, but the problem would be if we did it at the same time as the room transition, the warp object wouldn't know what our target object is and it would crash. So now we're saying if we're in the target room, that means we've already transitioned and we need to set the player's new coordinates. So that's very, very easy. We just set the player's X and Y to our target object's X and Y, which is again, this thing. And then you see that I have set the face of our player to the image index of our target object. And that's because this object has no code in it, but what it does have is its own unique sprite that I made, which corresponds to the face variable. So remember, face, we got 0 is right, 1 is up, 2 is left, 3 is down. So basically I just took the first sprite of each of our players' walking animation and put them in one single sprite, and then made them, not totally opaque so they would kind of see through, so I wouldn't mistake it for a player object for 1, but 2, just so that way I know that this is like an invisible helper object. So I made this sprite and I set the speed to 0. So that way in my room editor, I could just open up this little tab and change whatever direction I wanted the player to be facing whenever they show up. So that's what's going on here. So if my frame is 0 like this, it's facing to the right, which means that whenever we do the actual transition somewhere, where did I put that thing? There it is. Okay, so whenever we do the actual transition, we're making our player automatically face the same way that our target object is. And so this means that this is great. So whatever I want to do at any point, I can move this target object to a different location. Like say for some reason I want him to come out of this mausoleum, I could just move it over there and then do that. And so now it's properly coming out of the mausoleum. So I think that's pretty cool. So put that back to here. So we're doing all that. And then remember our O warp here is a screen pauser, and you can read all this, but basically because it's a screen pauser, that means that our player isn't running pretty much any of their step event code, right? So the player's not automatically setting their own sprite or their aiming direction, or they're updating their center Y coordinate, which is going to be important because we're changing our player's Y coordinate. So you could do one of two things. You could do what I've done here, which is just immediately go into our object player and set the sprite and aiming direction and center Y automatically in this object based on this new information. Or you could like take this block of code, you can go into the player, and before we have any of the screen pausing stuff, you could just say take this block, and instead of saying with object player do this, you could just say if instance exists O warp, then run this code, and just do it above the screen pausing, and that would give you the same exact effect, right? So this might be a better way to do it, and just say update visuals for room warping, and you can put that there. It would work exactly the same. So I could even just go into that object warp and comment this stuff out and show you that it works exactly the same by running the game and just going through. So if I walk out here, see, it works fine. I was facing the right. And another thing it technically doesn't do is if you're in like a lower step animation, you can see that, like, well, it'd be kind of hard to get it, but yeah, so you see the image index, it started like squatted, and then, so we could even go there, we could even go back into the player here and also force the image index to be 0 if we wanted to. So yeah, anyways, so we've moved the player, and one way or another we fixed the player's movement. Might as well just add that line here as well, just to remember that that's there, but could also just get rid of this. It doesn't really matter. So anyways, we've finished the transition. The player has moved to the new room, and their coordinates and facing direction and all their image stuff has been fixed. And then just to destroy ourselves, we're saying if we are in the reverse part of the animation, which means if our image speed is equal to -1 and our image index is less than 1, which means we're on this first sub image here, which is just nothing. This one's completely blank, so that means now that it's invisible, you can just destroy ourselves. And that means it's totally done and that we've gotten rid of ourselves. So that's how the actual warp object works, and that's how it works with our like coordinate target thingy over here, right there. Now we can just finally talk about our little warp block and how it spawns our object warp, and that's really, really easy. So first, if we go into the create event, you'll see that it also has the target room and the target object variables, and that's because that's where our object warp gets it, is these. So the way this works is if our player is running into this warp block and a warp object does not exist, then we simply create a warp object. I'll give you all that comment there. You just create a warp object, and then you have that warp object inherit its target room and target object from this warp block. Super, super easy. And that just means that we're setting our target room and target object in the creation code of these. So basically you can see what I did here is I opened this up and go into creation code. For the target room, I picked the room, obviously, which is just the one I want to go to. So room level 2. And then we just need to go find the ID of that other object. So I'm going to open up room level 2. This was the target object that I had. So I opened it up and I copied its instance ID right here, went back into level 1, and then pasted in its instance ID. And same thing for the other one. So I just copied the instance ID of this specific object, and I knew I wanted it to pair with this warp object. So I opened this up. I told it I wanted to go to room 1, and then I told it this is the target object I'm looking for. So with all that together, it it just works. So yeah, pretty simple stuff. And like I said, there was a few things to consider while going through. The player persistence was important. The object warp's persistence. The player's image control while in the warping state was important. Now, one quick thing that I want to mention is it seems that GameMaker nowadays, which I wasn't actually totally aware of this, it seems GameMaker does a pretty good job of realizing that if an object is persistent, that it shouldn't create another version of that same object, as long as it's placed in the room editor at least. So we shouldn't be getting multiple versions of our player object when we leave and come back in rooms and stuff like that. So, which is good information to have. I wasn't totally sure that that was a thing, but I know it used to not be that way. So it used to be where if you had a persistent object like in this room, if I were to walk out and walk back in with the player, there would be 2 players, but they would just be like right on top of each other, so it'd be kind of hard to tell. But seems like that's not really the case anymore. So yeah, we're all pretty good. If you were having a problem with having multiple players, you could add in a code like this at its creation code and say like, if the number of players is greater than 1, then destroy self. So this would just, because it's creation code, this would just mean that any new player objects after the first one would just destroy themselves. But you know, doesn't really seem to be necessary. So yeah, which that's actually news to me. So that kind of, you know, maybe you don't even need the initialization room anymore. Who knows? But yeah. So that's the room transition stuff. That's pretty much the main stuff, that kind of the main baggage that comes with that. And there's our bonus episode. What you say? Peyton, there's more. The video's very long from here on out. I know. And actually, funny thing about that. Uncharacteristically, I actually recorded the outro of this one as I was recording the video. And I figured since it was our last one, I did some discussion in it too, actually. Which, if you heard my last outro, I was like, I'm going to make a discussion video. And I did make a discussion video. So there's basically like 2 little discussion sections. And yeah, there's a couple times where I repeat myself about certain topics and things like that. And also the outro of this itself and the sign off is pretty similar to the last one. So, you know, don't mind me just sounding like a broken record. But I will say the discussion in this one is more focused on this game specifically. And I talk about some different things too, because the discussion video I had was also kind of off the top of my head, but I had some broader topics that I wanted to talk about in that one that were more just game development, game dev related. So I didn't talk about that stuff here. And I wanted to make that video a little bit more like potentially friendly for people who didn't watch the top-down shooter series, so they could also get something out of it too. So definitely listen to this discussion and watch the discussion video. But again, you might hear me repeat myself on a couple different points. Again, same with the sign off of this. So it's not really much for me to say. I just want to go ahead and say thank you, Patreon members. You're the best. And I'm just gonna go ahead and do the shout outs right now. So I'm gonna give my shout outs to Nixionic, Red Dragon Redemption, Null, Joseph Sandlin, Midnight, Jericho Deloach, Aogio, Homeless Bums Ahoy, Captain Ludwig, Christian Donovan, Nick, Crunch Sting, Mike Yeager, 8Pod, Zail, Virus Alharden, and Jamie Wary, or maybe Weary. Sorry if I got that wrong. You guys are always the best, so thank you, thank you. Okay, on to the end of the video and discussion or whatever it was. The main reason that I wanted to show you the room transition stuff is one, you know, most people would probably want to know how to, but the other point is that you should be able to find other resources and just be able to add stuff to your game, especially like, you know, my videos. There's a few on different topics. There's like a sound effect video, which would be really, really useful for adding sound effects into your game. And it's a system that I like a lot. So yeah, you could like go back and watch other videos and you can add stuff to this because we've done a huge amount of work on this. It's just kind of whatever you want now and how you want to do it. So yeah, that was sort of the main reason I wanted to show you that, is because that stuff has been done in another video before. So yeah, just go watch some of those. Go watch other people's videos. That's always a very good thing to do. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Like I was just saying, so many different things that you could add to it. So many things that are just like little or stuff that I've already covered, or things that would be better covered in standalone videos that I didn't want to do with this series, even though I wanted to be really thorough. So yeah, it's pretty much done. The fact that this is labeled as a bonus video, it means that, you know, I feel like I've already gotten into pretty, you know, unimportant stuff as far as a top-down shooter goes. But with that being said, I also did a stream where I kind of like finished this game, I guess. I don't know. I actually haven't done the stream yet. It's just by the time that you're watching this on YouTube, I probably did the stream a good while ago. So there is a stream on this channel. Should be, whatever, a VOD or something. I don't know. I don't know how it works. I'm gonna have to figure it all out. But basically the idea is that I'm gonna finish up the game, as in like add a couple more zombie enemies or something like that. Maybe add like a boss, add some more levels, some more tile sets, and just kind of have some fun. Maybe add some sound effects and music and show the creative process on that. And that video is going to be way more like me working my speed, me just going through the creative process and making some decisions and some alterations to the game and the code and stuff like that. So watching me do some like pixel art and things like that. So yeah, it's basically going to be the final cap on this. So definitely watch that. It should be some fun, hopefully. But yeah, let that sunk cost fallacy kick in there, huh? I've already come this far. Might as well give it a go. But yeah, I'm going to be talking about a bunch of stuff about it if anyone has any questions, I'll probably be just answering anything people ask me, but I figured this would also be a good place to just kind of talk about the general design of the game that we have here, and some of the decisions that we made, and strength and potential shortcomings of some things. I just kind of want to talk about it off the top of my head for a second. So yeah, I think we've made a really great skeleton of a game here, like really good. I'm very happy with how easy some of the like functions came out, and how hopefully easy it should be to implement new stuff and use the things that you already have to your advantage. I am very pleased with it. I'm very pleased. Now, there are a couple things that are just kind of weird and hard. One thing that's just difficult in general with top-down games is just depth, right? The fact that we didn't use a GUI layer and we just decided to do everything with the draw event meant that we had to keep better track of our depth. The way our tiles worked with the upper ground levels that show up on top of the player, where you can kind of see the in-between on them. And you know, they had some restrictions on the size they should be, like they probably shouldn't be one tall, and if they are really tall, you shouldn't be able to see yourself behind certain parts and that kind of thing. So those are definitely limitations, and for most games that you make, you're just going to have to come to terms with there are going to be limitations. There are certain things that you're going to have to say, okay, I need to work around this and factor this in. But hopefully I showed you some ways where you could say, oh, okay, this was going to be a limitation, but there are actual ways to fix it. For example, like the mausoleum spawners, not being able to put them near walls at first. That was pretty bad at first. It's something you could have totally worked through and designed around, right? Like you could have totally just made sure that there weren't any tight corridors for them to be in, and that would have been fine. And in your final game, you might find that that's just where you put them anyways, but it was a problem that we could have solved, and we did solve it, so that was good. Pretty happy with a lot of that stuff. Obviously, there's no like cutscene implementation and stuff like that, because that's just a big topic that I would like to cover in its own sort of video, and probably a topic that I will cover in the eventual turn-based RPG series, which is coming at one point. I have to finish other projects, but you know, that's coming, and so I didn't want to have to cover anything double like that, and I figure cutscenes are a lot more important in that kind of game. So yeah, so some good stuff, some things that aren't probably my favorite. The gun or magic rod or whatever is just a little bit long, and so if you had really, really short walls, it'd be easy to just like put your weapon through the wall. And again, we could have added things like line collision detections to make sure that that didn't happen, but just would have been a lot of extra work and more complicated. So for what we have, I think we've like minimized our limitations pretty well and made it to where that we can have some pretty cool levels and just some pretty fun levels. As far as like design decisions that we did or didn't make, one thing that I think is worth considering and talking about is the fact that all the weapons shoot pretty fast, right? Even the shotgun shoots pretty fast, to where there's not really ever a point where you probably don't want to be shooting, unless of course you don't want to shoot like a TNT barrel or something like that, in which, yeah, that makes sense, or you don't want to shoot a crate because it's a valuable resource to have for blocking some enemies down a certain path or whatever. But generally the way it's kind of working is there's not really a trade-off for not shooting the weapon. So I think on the stream, what I'm going to do, or you know, at this point what I already did, I guess, but what I want to do is I'm probably going to change like the player's walking speed. Like the player might be able to move a little bit faster while not shooting, and then while shooting goes a little bit slower. I might even add in bullet counts and weapon pickups, and like ammo pickups just for fun. That would require sort of changing the number of enemies and like how they drop stuff pretty substantially, but yeah, I'm probably going to try stuff like that out. Again, the reason I didn't show any of that is just because that should be really easy for you to add in. It's literally just number checks, you know, and subtracting values from a variable. If you don't have enough bullets to shoot, then you don't get to shoot. You know, that's all it would be. So yeah, I'm probably going to experiment with some stuff, but that to me would be one of the first things I think of where I say, okay, that is something I wouldn't want in a personal game of mine. I would probably need for there to be a reason for the player not to be shooting all the time, or if they did need to be shooting all the time, just, I don't know, maybe just have the shoot button be like a toggle, like an on-off switch, so people wouldn't have to be holding down a button for like minutes and minutes at a time. And I mean, if you played the game for 30 minutes, half an hour just holding down a button and you never let go of it. So something like that, figuring things out for that. Another one is the zombie enemies are good, I think. I think they're very, very simple. They're very exploitable, so especially if you have like the elevated ground or wall objects, it's very easy to hang them up on them and then get them off screen, or even keep them on screen at that point because their bullets won't even be that much of an issue. So that is why a lot of the level design just has empty spaces for walls or water for walls, so that way that the enemies can stay a pretty consistent source of danger. But I do think they're good. I just think that different enemy types would be pretty good to have in there too, you know. Maybe some stationary enemies that are pretty dangerous, or like an enemy that is kind of like a mini boss or a boss that they can still shoot you even if they're off screen, because there's probably only going to be one or two of them at once. So you don't have to worry about the player getting flooded with 10,000 bullets, but you know, keeping them as something the player has to worry about and deal with until they go deal with them. So yeah, I think there's lots of room to improve this from a game design standpoint, and you know, that's up to you. There's also stuff like a dodge state or something like that, which I just didn't really want to add in because it probably would have gotten us into state machines a little too early. And to be honest with this kind of game, I don't think this kind of game really benefits from having dodge and iframes and stuff like that too much. Not to say it isn't fun, because it is, but I was having a lot of fun just sort of carefully weaving in and out between the bullets and the enemies, and I think having like a dash or a dodge button would kind of make the game just too easy. So I really liked the old school arcadey feel that it had with just walking around and just shooting. So, but yeah, that's something that you could add, you know, and I might even add it on the stream for fun. I probably won't, but you know, I might do something like it. But yeah, so good luck with your games. Have fun figuring out like what kind of stuff you want to make special about your game, or just have fun hammering out and making your first game. It doesn't have to be something super crazy or a pinnacle design or anything like that. You know, making a game is fun, and having other people play it is fun. So just focus on that if you want to. That's totally cool. Either way, I guess I'll close out this bonus episode. I assume this series was quite long, so I assume that tons of people dropped off by this point, and probably there's another big drop off just between the last episode and this one, because I labeled this one as a bonus. But yeah, so there's probably not too many people hanging out watching this right now. But thank you so much if you did. If you watched all these, you're awesome. You're probably going to be a very cool game dev one day who commits well to making games and stuff like that. So good on you. Proud of you. Like seriously, if you want like a little confidence booster from this episode right now, just go ahead and like check the current number of views on this one, and then now check the number of views on the first video, right? So you're whatever that percentile is of people. So yeah, have fun. Watch that the VOD of that stream if I managed to get it up. I'm sure I did. I can't be that dumb, can I? But yeah, watch that, because that's one more thing for this series that should be fun. And good luck making games, huh? Oh, and go to my Patreon, please. Thank you. Sorry, I just had to add that in because I'd kick myself if I forgot to while I was editing this. Yeah, go to my Patreon, okay? And support me if you want to, and if you can. If you're financially able and you want to, then feel free to support me. Otherwise, you did a great job supporting me by just watching all the way to this video anyway. So thank you. Thank you. You're the best. All right, see you around. Bye-bye now.